Welcome to Trump's Trade War, the Hub's daily YouTube channel looking at Trump's trade moves and Canada's response, the response of individual Canadians and the response of their government. I'm Harrison Lohman, managing editor of the Hub, and today I am so pleased to be joined by Trevor Toome. He's a professor of economics at the University of Calgary. He's a valued Hub contributor, and he's also a research fellow at the School of Public Policy there. Trevor, how are you doing today?
Not too bad. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. Day 44 of this trade war, if you can believe it. Tomorrow, you'll have a piece in our pages called The Cost of Tariffs. The cost of tariff retaliation rises again. So you calculated a few days ago the costs of phase one when it comes to retaliation in terms of consumer products. We'll be looking at phase two today. But I'm wondering, just bird's eye view here, Trevor, what is phase two of the trade war? Is this still part of the opening salvo? Are we caught in the trenches in some sort of stalemate? Or is this like a pitched final battle? How can we situate ourselves here?
Well, it's hard to predict where we're going from here, but it does seem like we are just in the opening phases of the trade war between Canada and the United States. Of course, there was February 1, that broad 25% on goods and 10% on energy that the US wanted to levy, and that was pared back and ultimately temporarily suspended. But we did retaliate at the time, and we kept that retaliation in place on about $30 billion worth of imports, charging a 25% import tax on those. But just a few days ago, the US opened another front in the trade war with tariffs on steel and aluminum, not just on Canada, but on many countries. And Canada opted to retaliate with another set of tariffs on, again, about $30 billion worth of imports from the US at 25%. But what makes this kind of second round of the trade war a little bit different is that round one really focused almost predominantly on consumer goods and food, items where, fairly straightforward in most cases to substitute into consuming some other good and not really levying a tax on imported inputs that our businesses use to produce other goods. This second round is a little different in that it's covering more industrial supplies and far fewer consumer goods or food items that the first one did. So think about, of course, we're levying the retaliation also on steel and aluminum, but then a lot of products that are made from those. Think about wires, various stainless steel products. We have pipes and tubes and things like this also covered. So now we're starting to levy tariffs on items that are inputs to produce yet other items. And this is where the economic costs start to mount when you're disrupting how we're producing within Canada.
So before we jump into that graph for phase two, getting a sense of our latest battle in this trade war, just give us a sense of how much is it going to add to overall household consumption costs for Canadians?
That's right. Well, at first, we may see very little effect if the tariffs are not hitting things that we buy directly. I should say phase two does cover some things that we buy directly, umbrellas being an item covered by this second round. But to the extent that we're levying tariffs on inputs, it'll take time for that to filter through supply chains and get passed on to consumers. But once it does, I estimate that it adds about 0.5% to the overall cost of households' final consumption of all goods and services. And that's an average kind of across the board. Some things like jewelry tops the list at prices that might rise by about 2%, clothing by about 1.5%, footwear a little bit behind that. So it does ultimately get passed through to consumers. And, those numbers might sound small, but that 0.5% overall should be viewed relative to our 2% inflation target. So what would have been a 2% average increase, add half a point to that.
Elia, let's put up this graph here. So this is phase two. Folks, if you look at the red, that's direct impacts. Blue is supply chain impacts. And as Trevor just said, look at the top there. Jewelry, clothing, footwear, sporting equipment. As you mentioned, Trevor, that will be the hardest hit, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so the red is the direct effect of the tariff on purchases that are imported, and blue is it'll take a little bit more time as things filter through supply chains. Now, some of these are also like games and toys and hobbies and things like that. might come later. I mean, we're levying as part of this second phase tariffs on Christmas related items. And so that might not be a relevant purchase in the short term, but if these tariffs remain in place, then it becomes more relevant later on in the year.
Sure. So I'm just going to jump to what, when taken all together, uh, this is what we're seeing, right? And you point to,
That's right.
okay, what's going to rise when I'm going to the shop? What will I be most frustrated by? What's my biggest sticker shock? Furniture,
That's right.
food prices, right? That's what you're pointing towards?
Exactly. And this is including this second round in addition to the tariffs that were previously
The
levied a
first
couple of
round.
weeks ago, that first round. In total, we're looking at consumer price increases on the order of about 1%, with furniture seeing price increases potentially in excess of 3%, and food rising by about that average rate of about 1%.
So, Trevor, what's your message to Canadians who say things like 1%? Like, I come out of this relatively unscathed. I can weather this for another, 6 months or so. There was talk of the Canadian population having to be impoverished, etc. Grandiose terms being used in headlines. What's
Yeah.
your response to those Canadians who say, what gives? This isn't really anything. It's a blip.
Yeah, we shouldn't think about this in such black and white terms. Certainly, a 1% increase in prices will not mean a complete shutdown of the Canadian economy, and we're all impoverished as a result. But we should think about this price increase relative to our desired planned price increase that the Bank of Canada is mandated to try and achieve at 2%. And moving from 2 to 3, that's a 50% increase in the pace of price growth. And this is, as I noted at the start here, maybe just the beginning of a much broader trade war. And when a small country like Canada retaliates in the form of tariffs against a larger one, the effect is to increase consumer prices here. So this is just the beginning. And if things continue, then consumer price increases as a result will grow much larger than this.
The whole frog in the pot boiling sort of thing. How high could it go, Trevor? I hate asking academics to look in their crystal balls, but like, how bad could this get?
That is a tough question, and it is really hard to provide a precise answer to it because how the trade war evolves, how we respond, is something that appears to be changing daily. The structure of the tariff, the size of them that the US levies, how we respond. Some were promoting tariffs of 100% on certain selected US items, how taxes on, like Ontario Premier Ford suggested, on electricity exports and other items. So it all depends on how this all unfolds. But just for context, myself and some other analysts were trying to think about what a broad 25% tax on almost everything might mean. And there, the consumer price index for Canada might rise by about 4%, I estimate. And so then that would be from a 2% rate of inflation to 6, right? So it's really getting us into levels that we hadn't seen since the inflation spike, I guess thankfully now a year or 2 years ago. And so that would be a really challenging situation to be in.
Just looking back at that graph, I'm wondering if there's any areas you'd point to where you'd say, hey, this industry or this product comes out relatively unscathed when compared to, we're looking at jewelry, clothing, footwear, furniture, etc. Is there somewhere we can say, that these folks specifically will weather the storm given X, Y, Z?
Yeah, for the most part, services are going to fare, relatively speaking, better than goods. And most of the Canadian economy is producing services. That's where most Canadians are employed. That's where most of the value that we produce each year is. And tariffs are not really levied on services, they're levied on goods that cross the border. And so those who are in service sectors are indirectly affected only to the extent that they're purchasing as an input the goods that we have tariffs levied on. So many Canadians may not directly actually be in an employer that's really subject to the tariffs, only indirectly exposed through supply chains or exposed as consumers when they see prices increase.
Two final questions. One, in terms of returning fire, one thing that's being done, I guess, on the quote home front is Canadians refusing to buy certain American products. You see shots on various news channels of shelves of American pears that are not being bought. Other signs pointing Canadian consumers toward made in Canada products. is this, as an economist, is this for us in terms of, our patriotism and feeling like we're doing our bit as individuals, or is this actually going to have an effect on the American economy, you think? I know you're starting to look at this now.
Yeah, that's a great question. It is too soon to say. Data does take time to come in. We'll start getting the data from Statistics Canada on February trade flows in a couple of weeks. I think it might take time to really see the effect of any kind of broad consumer boycott to the extent that there is one, because a lot of retailers think about what Loblaws will be doing in anticipation of tariffs. They likely purchased a lot of items in January prior to the tariffs, trying to get in under the wire when those tariffs were levied. So in the short term, we might see increases in trade volumes before any kind of consumer boycott effect might be visible. Definitely something to watch for. As an economist, though, I think about this moment as one that reminds us about the value of trade. It allows us to specialize in things that we're particularly good at and buy from others. And so, buy local campaigns or efforts to increase the amount we're purchasing just from, our own backyard is to also kind of voluntarily move even further towards protectionism and away from the gains from trade. So I do see if this kind of mounts or continues, and I don't suspect that it will, that there's broader adverse productivity implications of this for Canada.
Final question. How does a country know if it's lost or won a trade war? How is this measured? We talk about an endpoint here, how bad it could get, but what is the endpoint at the end of the day? How does from where you stand, is there a way we could measure a point where the U.S. would say, okay, we've now won this thing?
The challenge here is that it is not clear what the underlying motivation is for the tariffs being levied by the United States. We have a lot of objectives that have been put out by members of the administration, and some of them are not internally consistent. Is it about fentanyl and migration? Is it about raising revenues to facilitate income tax reductions in the United States? Is it about the trade balance and the deficit they have with Canada? Is it about the amount of manufacturing jobs that exists in the United States? Each of these needs to be thought of separately. And I think part of maybe what the administration has in mind is defining the ultimate objectives here so broadly and so vaguely as to give them flexibility to claim victory almost no matter what happens.
Yeah, well, we'll have to wait and see what that victory looks like, what loss looks like. I am hoping to not see you on day 84, Trevor. But onwards and upwards, I guess. That's Trevor Tombe,
Indeed.
professor of economics at the University of Calgary, also a very valued hub contributor on our site. Thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you. My pleasure.